Parkinson's is really tricky. We don't know good days from bad days until you're in it. You can plan and plan and plan and plan, but you just...
What if one of the world's loudest legends left behind a silence that said more than his music ever could? When news broke of Ozzy Osbourne's death on July 23, 2025, headlines exploded with tributes to the heavy metal pioneer, the wild man of rock, the unfiltered force who redefined chaos on stage. But behind those headlines, behind the screaming guitars and endless tour footage, was something no one expected. Not a backstage video or an unreleased track, but a single, untouched room that held the key to understanding the man behind the madness. It wasn't in a studio, a vault, or even in a church. It was in his private garage, sealed for months, untouched by his family, crew, or even Sharon herself. What they discovered there wasn't just a car collection. It was something raw, personal, a whisper from a man who had spent decades screaming into microphones, hidden notes, forgotten lyrics, a message no one was meant to read. But it wasn't just what they found, it was what it revealed about Ozzy, because behind the makeup, the screaming crowds, the scandals, and the darkness was someone who was desperately holding on to something quiet, something real. The garage wasn't a secret storage space, it was a time capsule filled with memories, regret, survival, and one heartbreaking final goodbye. And once the garage door opened, everything we thought we knew about the Prince of Darkness would be turned upside down. On July 22, 2025, the world didn't just lose a music legend, it lost a man whose voice had become the thunder in a million hearts, a soul that screamed, stumbled, soared, and somehow survived everything thrown its way. Ozzy Osbourne, the eternal Prince of Darkness, breathed his last at 76, and while headlines screamed of his legacy and fans across continents raised their horns in tribute, something eerie hung in the air, an unnatural stillness. From Birmingham's grungy alleys to Hollywood's neon glow, candles flickered beneath murals, speakers blasted Crazy Train into the night, and old concert videos flooded social media feeds as fans mourned the man who had once defied death itself, more times than anyone could count. Yet, while the world lit up in chaos and sound, one corner of Ozzy's home remained silent. His garage. No one dared go near it. Not Sharon, not the kids, not even the longtime bandmates who had shared decades of noise and pain with him. It stood like a tombstone to a side of Ozzy the world never truly saw, a man who once roared on stage, now retreated into this space alone. And what waited behind that garage door wasn't gold records or platinum plaques. It was something deeper, something sacred, something no one was prepared to face. Because the world was mourning a rock god, but in that garage, they were about to meet the man behind the myth. In a mansion surrounded by noise, it was the quietest room that held Ozzy Osbourne's most vulnerable truths. Hidden behind a weathered steel door and cloaked in layers of dust and secrecy, Ozzy's garage was never a place for engines or ego. It was a sanctuary, carved out in silence by a man whose life had been anything but. In the final months of his life, as Parkinson's disease gnawed at his body and years of excess weighed heavy on his soul, the garage stood untouched. Not even Sharon crossed that threshold. No staff, no friends, no family dared to disturb it. Ozzy's kingdom of chaos had one forbidden wing, and inside it, the chaos fell away. There were no stage lights, no roaring crowds, just shadows and stillness. And he liked it that way. He'd disappear into it for hours, sometimes overnight, leaving the rest of the house to wonder if he'd fallen asleep at the wheel of a memory, because that's what the garage was. It wasn't a room, it was a diary written in dust, chrome, and silence. It held no fame, no filtered footage, only the residue of a man trying to remember who he was before the world told him what he should be. After his death, it was Sharon who hesitantly opened that door, and what she found wasn't clutter or chaos. It was reverence, a place frozen in time, untouched by the cameras or critics, where the ghost of Ozzy sat not as a rock star, but as a human being still holding on to pieces of himself the world never got to see. When the garage door creaked open for the first time after Ozzy's passing, it wasn't just metal groaning, it was history breathing. Inside, the air was thick, not with dust, but with meaning. Rows of forgotten vehicles stood like loyal sentinels, their windshields dulled by time, their engines long silent, yet somehow alive with memory. But these weren't collector's trophies lined up for admiration, they were pieces of a broken mosaic that only Ozzy could piece together. On the passenger seats lay crumpled scraps of paper, some no bigger than a napkin, others folded concert set lists with scribbled thoughts on the back. One Rolls-Royce had a hand-marked calendar tucked in the glove box, days circled with no explanation. A Ferrari's dashboard held faded Polaroids, yellowed with time, of a young Sharon laughing beside him at a roadside diner. On the floor of a Bentley sat a cracked cassette labeled "Do Not Play." None of it made sense to anyone else, but it didn't have to. Every smudge on the window, every fingerprint in the dust was a line in a journal Ozzy never shared. The oil stains weren't messes, they were timestamps. The scratches on the doors weren't damage, they were scars that told the truth. There were no speakers playing music in that garage, yet the silence was symphonic. It sang of late-night confessions, unspoken regrets, fleeting joy, and moments where Ozzy sat behind the wheel, not to go anywhere, but to feel something, anything that reminded him he was still human beneath the legend. This wasn't a garage, it was a cathedral of memory, and every car inside it was a shrine. Before the sold-out arenas and flashing cameras, before the black eyeliner and backstage madness, Ozzy Osbourne was just a poor kid on the worn-out streets of Birmingham, where dreams didn't come on tour buses, they came in brief stolen moments behind the wheel of borrowed cars. His love for machines didn't blossom in wealth or fame, it bloomed in alleyways and scrapyards, among cracked windshields and exhaust fumes. As a teenager, Ozzy didn't have access to driver's ed or his own vehicle. He had instinct and desperation. He'd sneak into old vans and rusted-out Fords left unattended by neighbors, just to feel the steering wheel between his fingers, and pretend, if only for a second, that he was going somewhere far from the life that tried to cage him. To Ozzy, cars weren't about horsepower or prestige, they were escape plans. They were engines of rebellion that could take him away from hunger, fear, and silence. When Black Sabbath began its legendary climb, the road to fame was paved with bad shocks and worse directions. The band crammed themselves into creaky vans, stuffed with amps and sleeping bags, scraping together shows and chasing something bigger. And when that something finally came, it hit like a freight train. Ozzy's first splurge wasn't a mansion or a yacht, it was a black Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow. It was sleek, commanding and beautiful, much like Ozzy believed his new life would be. But just like the illusion of stability in his whirlwind world, the Rolls didn't last. Crashed within a year, it was a brutal reminder that even luxury could be fleeting. But the damage didn't shake his love, it cemented it. Cars were never trophies, they were pages in his autobiography. Whether they broke down or burst forward, they moved with him through chaos, heartbreak, triumph, and transformation. And no matter how far the tour took him, or how deep the darkness pulled, behind the wheel, Ozzy was always free. To outsiders, Ozzy Osbourne's garage might have looked like an aging rock star's private showroom, filled with muscle cars, luxury badges, and forgotten parts. But to those who truly knew him, it was a graveyard of emotions disguised in chrome and leather. He didn't hoard cars to show off. There were no press tours, no automotive magazine spreads, no glamorous Instagram shots of revving engines or burnouts in the driveway. His vehicles weren't status symbols, they were therapy. Each one held a weight only he could feel. A deep black Rolls-Royce Phantom V with blood-red velvet seats reminded him of the reckless highs and near-fatal lows of the Blizzard of Oz tour. A sleek Ferrari 456 GT wasn't just a gift, it was a symbol of personal survival after a grueling solo performance, a moment where the crowd screamed and he realized he was still worth watching. The Dodge Demon sat untouched in the corner, powerful and intimidating, much like Ozzy's past, always threatening to wake up. The Jaguar XJ22, built for speed but barely driven, was more a mirror of the risks he never took than the ones he did. And the camper van, an old worn-out Volkswagen with sun-faded curtains, wasn't just a relic. It was memory in motion, a reminder of simpler days with Sharon, when dreams were still cheap and love didn't come with contracts or cameras. Sharon once tried to help organize the garage, to sort and catalog the chaos, but Ozzy stopped her. He didn't want order, he wanted feeling. He kept broken mirrors, cracked fenders, and dusty cassettes because they weren't trash, they were moments. He remembered which car he was sitting in when he wrote a forgotten lyric. He knew which glove box held the stub from the night his son was born. These weren't machines, they were silent witnesses to everything Ozzy couldn't say aloud. In a life drenched in volume and spectacle, his garage was his confession booth. And for a man who spent decades trying to scream his truth, sometimes it was the engines that understood him best. For every note Ozzy Osbourne hit on stage, there was an echo of controversy that chased it into the headlines. While fans worshiped the wild energy, the howling vocals, and the chaos that danced behind his eyes, the rest of the world often saw something darker, something dangerous. Ozzy wasn't just a musician, he was a lightning rod for panic, blame, and moral outrage. From the moment he sang lyrics that defied convention, religious groups declared war. They branded him a threat, a corrupter of youth, even comparing him to Aleister Crowley, the notorious occultist, especially after Ozzy released the song Mr. Crowley. Despite publicly denying any connection to Satanism and those closest to him swearing he often prayed backstage, the narrative stuck. But things turned from controversial to infamous when, in a drug and alcohol-fueled haze, Ozzy bit the head off a dove during a business meeting with CBS executives. It wasn't a publicity stunt, it wasn't premeditated. It was raw, unfiltered madness, and it terrified everyone in the room. Just a year later, a fan tossed a bat onto the stage in Iowa. Ozzy, thinking it was rubber, bit into it live in front of thousands. The bat was real, the bite was real, and the rabies shots that followed only added to the legend. The media devoured him, parents panicked, the myth of the Prince of Darkness was solidified, but what followed was even darker. In the years ahead, his name became tied to real-life tragedies, people who committed unthinkable acts after allegedly listening to his songs. One young man took lives after playing Bark at the Moon. Another ended his own after listening to a track meant to warn against addiction. Courts got involved. Ozzy was sued. But time and again, the judges ruled in his favor. The lyrics didn't command violence. They were cries of survival. Still, the damage to his reputation stuck like dried blood. His own bandmates turned on him, accusing him of withholding royalties and erasing their contributions. Legal battles erupted, including one with Tony Iommi over the very name Black Sabbath. And if that wasn't enough, behind closed doors, Ozzy was unraveling. He admitted to killing his own cats during a breakdown in the 80s. He nearly strangled Sharon in a blackout episode in 1989, waking up in jail with no memory of the attempt. But she stayed, not because she was blind, but because she believed. While the world clung to the legend, Sharon clung to the man, flawed, broken, bleeding, but not beyond saving. And deep in the quiet corners of that garage, Ozzy's demons didn't scream. They whispered. As the spotlight dimmed and Ozzy Osbourne's body began to betray him, the roar that once echoed through arenas was slowly replaced by something more painful: silence. The same man who once dominated stages with unrelenting fire now shuffled through hallways, his hands trembling, his speech slowing, and his eyes losing the reckless spark that once lit up the darkest corners of rock and roll. The toll of decades caught up with him all at once: Parkinson's disease, nerve damage, addiction withdrawals, and the weight of memories too heavy to carry. The garage, once alive with late-night revs, greasy wrenches, and spontaneous songwriting behind the wheel, became still. Sharon watched it all happen, watched the man she loved dissolve beneath the layers of illness and history. And in a moment that broke her heart, she made a decision that would hurt them both. She began selling the cars. Not for money, not for space, but for survival. She saw what those vehicles meant to Ozzy, each one a temptation, a memory, a siren calling him back to the reckless version of himself. The Rolls-Royce went first, then the Ferrari, and finally, the Aston Martin, the one that once made Ozzy feel like he could fly. There were no goodbyes, no interviews, no media leaks, just quiet sales, arranged behind closed doors, each transaction another invisible tear in the fabric of Ozzy's world. He begged her to let him keep two. She allowed one. It stayed, tucked away in the corner, the only remaining echo of a life that once moved at 150 miles per hour. Friends say he would sneak into the garage late at night, not to drive, not to tinker, but just to sit, alone, motionless, as if the leather seats still remembered his younger self and could help him feel whole again. That one car, whichever it was, became more than a machine. It was a coffin for memories, a cocoon of identity, a final place where Ozzy could confront the shadows of his past without judgment or applause. And in that quiet space, where the dust lay thick and the engine slept, Ozzy began to come to terms with something no stage ever taught him: how to say goodbye to a life that refused to let go. When Ozzy Osbourne's family finally stepped into his garage after his death, they expected oil stains, rusting chrome, and maybe a few forgotten souvenirs from decades of rebellion. But what they found instead shattered them. Tucked between dusty dashboards and curled seatbelts were pieces of Ozzy's heart, left behind in a silent code only the brave would ever dare to read. There were notes, hundreds of them, some old, others fresh, each written with a trembling hand and a tired soul. Some were ordinary reminders: check tire pressure, fix radio knob. But hidden among those mundane scribbles were entries that revealed the weight Ozzy carried in silence. One was written on the back of a 1987 concert set list: Sharon, don't sell the Aston. It's the only place I still feel like me. Another, folded inside a crumbling manila envelope, simply read: engines are loud, but they'll never drown out the demons. They found lyrics, raw and unfinished, scribbled in pen across fast food receipts and napkins, words about guilt, addiction, faith and fear, the kind of verses that never made it to vinyl because they were too personal, too honest. In the glove compartment of an old Bentley, they uncovered a verse written in shaky cursive that read, "I don't need applause, I need silence that forgives." But it was the 1969 Lincoln Continental in the far corner of the garage that stopped everything. Covered in 2 decades of dust, no one had seen it move since the early 90s, and no one even remembered it existed. Sharon stood frozen when she saw it, tears flooding her eyes as memories came rushing in. That Lincoln had been parked outside a hospital the night Ozzy nearly didn't come home. After an overdose nearly claimed his life, he left that car and never looked back. The keys were still in the ignition, a crumpled pack of cigarettes sat on the passenger seat. The odometer hadn't changed since night. Inside the glove box they found one final message, a line scrawled on a torn envelope: "This one's no longer in use, just like me." It was devastating, not because it marked an ending, but because it revealed how long Ozzy had been preparing to disappear. The family didn't restore the car. They didn't auction it. They covered it back up, not as a collector's item, but as a tombstone. A symbol of pain survived, a reminder that Ozzy made it out of that darkness, even if just barely. In that moment, the garage was no longer just a private space. It became a museum of the soul, echoing not with engine noise, but with the whispered confessions of a man who spent his whole life being heard, but never fully understood. As Ozzy Osbourne's health continued to decline, his body shrinking under the weight of years spent battling addiction, disease, and a lifetime of wear and tear, there was little left he could hold onto except memories. By 2025, Parkinson's had taken away most of his mobility. He couldn't sing, he couldn't walk on his own. The very force that once electrified millions had grown so frail, so quiet, it barely stirred. But in the quiet of his Buckinghamshire home, where every step was measured and every breath a challenge, Sharon Osbourne knew there was one thing that might give him a piece of himself back: his cars, the ones he had lost, the ones he had begged to keep. Sharon, who had stood beside him through every high and every near-fatal low, quietly began her mission. She didn't look for replicas or substitutes. She wanted the exact 2 cars Ozzy had loved most, a black Range Rover and a 1970 Aston Martin V8. They weren't just vehicles, they were anchors to moments that mattered. The Range Rover was his calm, a symbol of peaceful countryside drives, away from flashing lights and chaos. The Aston Martin was his fire, his independence, his freedom, the last roar of youth before everything changed. Tracking them down wasn't easy. The Aston had ended up in a California garage, nearly forgotten. The Range Rover had changed hands multiple times, but still bore the dents and scratches Ozzy himself had given it. Sharon made the calls. She pulled the strings. She paid whatever it took. She didn't tell Ozzy, not until the cars were delivered, not until the garage was opened one final time. When he saw them, his mouth didn't form words. His eyes filled with tears, and his hand, trembling and stiff, reached out and gently touched the hood of the Aston Martin. "You brought them back," he whispered. And then he asked, with barely a voice left to use, if he could sit in the Range Rover just one more time. With the help of his children, he was carried to the driver's seat. The door closed softly. He sat there alone for 15 minutes. No cameras, no reporters, no oxygen tank, just him and the memory of who he used to be. He didn't cry, he didn't smile, he simply breathed. Sharon stood outside the car, hands pressed over her chest, watching the man she had fought to save for decades quietly say goodbye to himself. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't staged, it was still, intimate, pure, a final gift from the woman who loved him most, a gift not of luxury, but of identity. For that moment, Ozzy wasn't the Prince of Darkness, the rock god, or the haunted headline. He was just a man in his favorite car, taking one last drive without moving an inch. When word of Ozzy Osbourne's death reached the world, there were no riots, no chaos, no thunder of fans pounding on his gates. Instead, something unexpected happened. Silence. A deep, respectful stillness wrapped itself around his Los Angeles home in Hancock Park, as if even the city knew that shouting wouldn't be appropriate this time. The man whose voice once split stadiums had taken his final breath, and all the world could do was pause. There were no fans scaling the gates, no flood of reporters swarming the driveway. People came slowly, reverently, their footsteps soft against the concrete, their eyes fixed not on the mansion, but on one humble corner of the property, the garage. Somehow, word had gotten out that this space mattered, that it wasn't just where Ozzy kept his toys, but where he had kept his soul. Flowers began to appear in small bunches along the garage's edge. Candles flickered in lines across the driveway, their wax pooling on warm pavement. Notes arrived, scribbled on torn concert tickets, old band merch, even napkins. One fan taped a Black Sabbath shirt to the garage door with a message scrawled in Sharpie, "You were the music to my life." Another note, damp from tears or dew, simply read, "You screamed, so I didn't have to." For days, people gathered, not for spectacle, but for healing. They didn't come to worship a celebrity. They came to grieve a man who had lived and suffered publicly, who had made every mistake, yet somehow still loved, still hoped, still tried. Just 1 month earlier, Ozzy had made his final stage appearance in Birmingham, performing from a black throne beside his original Black Sabbath bandmates. Nearly 40,000 people had watched him. Older, slower, but still defiant. No one knew it would be the last time. After his passing, his son Jack shared a photo of the growing tribute online, writing, "He wouldn't have liked the attention, but he'd have loved the love." And as the days passed, the garage took on a life of its own. It wasn't cordoned off, it wasn't turned into a museum, it remained untouched, just as Ozzy had left it, but it became something else entirely, a monument not to the madness, but to the man. Each vehicle now held more than just stories, they held weight. The smell of oil and leather mingled with the scent of candles and wilted roses. Napkins with unrecorded lyrics lay in glove boxes. Faded Polaroids peeked out from sun visors. Dusty windows bore the fingerprints of a legend whose true power wasn't in his voice, but in his vulnerability. The garage, once a place of retreat, became a symbol of survival. A place where Ozzy Osbourne was not just the Prince of Darkness, but a husband, a father, a fighter, and in his final days, a man who had finally found peace. So what do we make of the man who terrified parents, thrilled fans, and left the stage as quietly as he once stormed it? Ozzy Osbourne's garage wasn't just a place for tools and tires, it was a mirror, a reflection of a man who, after decades of being everything to everyone, sinner, savior, monster, genius, just wanted to be alone with the memories that made him human. He didn't ask for forgiveness in press releases, he didn't explain his demons in interviews, he simply wrote notes, scratched lyrics on napkins, and left behind a room filled with raw truth. While the world cheered his final shows and celebrated his chaos, it was in silence that Ozzy found himself. The man who once bit bats and defied death again and again, in the end, sat quietly in the seat of an old Range Rover, holding on to the last piece of peace he could feel. No rock anthem, no stage dive, no pyrotechnics, just stillness. That garage didn't just hold cars, it held confessions, regrets, triumphs, and a final act of grace. It reminded us that behind every headline and every howling guitar riff was a man just trying to survive himself. So now the question turns to us, what do we do with that truth? Do we still see him as the Prince of Darkness, or do we finally understand the soul behind the scream? Let us know in the comments, what did this story reveal to you about Ozzy that you never knew? And if this moved you, if you felt the weight of those final miles, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because sometimes the loudest stories are the ones told in whispers, and this was